welcome to today. Today's program is really exciting. We have Matt Adams in conversation with Sargon Oshana, and it's moderated by Nina Branner from Isena. And yeah, as you might have realized, the festival's cancelled, but we thought it important to still continue a conversation online for the industry, both in Denmark and out around in the world. And we're really happy and lucky that Bikubenfonden and Statens Kunstfond has supported this journey. But I will not say much more. I'll just say welcome to Nina and Matt and Sargon, and hope that you have the coffee ready and you will interact and ask your questions if you have any for them. So yeah, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Yes, I hope everybody can hear. We started up with some technical problems, which I guess is just the conditions that we have to live and work under these days. We're going to talk about something today which has become quite the buzzword, at least for the last few months, especially because of the many cancellations of theater plays and performances, namely digital theater. What is that? What works and what does not work? When theaters and performances throws themselves into the arms of new technologies and digital methods. Yeah, and in this respect, Matt Adams, you are quite the heavyweight, I might say, because you have been working more than 30 years in interactive art using different tools, technologies such as apps, video games, GPS systems, whatnot. Yeah, welcome to you. You are sitting in your studio in Brighton, is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Thank you. Thanks very much. It's great to be here, and I really look forward to talking with you, Nina and Sargon. Yeah, as you say, we started making work using digital technology in the early 1990s, and we did our first video stream project in 1998 and our first VR project in 1999. So we've always been interested in thinking about how digital technology might extend and transform the performative moment, and how performance might be rethought by digital platforms.
So we're going to talk lots more about that. But first, also a warm welcome to you, Sargon. You are. This is the first time. It's actually the second time that the two of you meet, because you met online 2 days ago, but you have never met in real life. But Matt, we can also tell you that Sargon in Denmark is known for his experimental approach to what a theater stage can look like in 2020. And you have in common that you both place a lot of importance on the interaction between the audience and the work of art and the artists. And although Sargon has already won the annual Danish Theatre Prize, the Reumert, he is today kind of playing the role as a new generation of artists who perhaps, whether they want to or not, are kind of forced to, at least in this situation, to think about what digital methods how they can be used, if they should be used. But I think we should just start off by defining what digital theater even means, because people might have different ideas about what this means. So I'm just going to throw it out there to you, Matt, first. When I say digital theater, what do you say?
I think it's no monolithic thing. It's no simple definition. It's exactly the same when you try and define theatre. It's a very broad spectrum. But you know, the British director Peter Brook, in his seminal book The Empty Stage, goes back to the roots of theatre, which is essentially one person who is performing to one person who is watching at one moment in time in one particular place. And that is the core of the theatrical experience, and everything else is an extension from there. And I suppose if you look at it in that simple way, where there's just these four elements: audience, performer, place, and time, you can then see how digital technology can vary and rework any of those four categories, any of those four ideas in very different ways. We're all familiar with the idea that that we are all scattered in space at the moment, and yet we also are in this event, and yet we are also sharing a space in some sense. And what's perhaps not so obvious is that we're also all experiencing time slightly differently because of the latency of a digital system, and so on. So, you know, for me, when you talk about digital theatre, you're talking about the ways in which digital platforms, not just technologies, but also platforms themselves, like the web or email or texting or Twitter or Facebook, create new possibilities for the interrelationships around which live performance can take place.
Mm-hmm. And Sargun, what are your thoughts on digitality in theatre?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here, and nice to meet you, Matt, and thank you for the kind words, Nina. As Matt says, I really agree about all the things that you said about how the digital theater also is that platform that in kind of way is a prism that can transcend to a lot of different portals in the written text or at the narrative of the person. I mean, I haven't done a lot of digital theater. Mostly I've been more interested in how to copy some of the ways that the digital theater work on the narrative, work on the audience, and try to copy that on my work in the theater stage or in theater. And I did that in the studio scene of stage in Aarhus Theater, where I was very like influenced by how different performance groups work with digital theater in that way, that they always used the audience as the first narrative, whereas often in theater the audience is an opponent that like you put in quite late in the journey of making the play or the work, whereas I see it as a way in incorporating the audience much earlier, and also having that in mind that the audience or the viewer will always be the main character, whereas in like most of the proscenium theater that we make, we think our characters as the main characters or the actors or the one that we watch. But I see it much more as the narrative is reflected on the viewer.
Yeah, I would totally agree that the really transformative quality of digital theatre is the agency of the audience, and that we've only just begun to really start on the process of thinking about how you create performative moments in which the audience are not just observers, but have a role, have meaningful agency, and could even be protagonists in the drama. And that's where digital theatre would connect up with games design as much as it would conventional playwriting or conventional forms of theatre production for me.
So this is obviously a field that's developing rapidly. But Matt, you have been working with technologies for a long time. I would like to ask you, when did your interest in working with arts and different technologies begin?
When I was in my late teens, I was really struck going to see theatre in London by how theatre had no interest in the audience, and that although it was a live event, it was presented as if it would be identical every night. And for me, that seemed such a kind of a defeatist position for an art form that was even then under pressure from film and television, pop music, radio, all other forms of media. And it seemed bizarre to me that live theatre did not fully embrace the quality of liveness. And so when, you know, Blast Theory is a collaboration. Originally there were 8 of us at the very first ever meeting of Blast Theory. There are still 3 of us standing today. And but those very first conversations that we had, and that was a group of people from all kinds of backgrounds, from art school backgrounds, from sport, from a DJ, you know, a real mix of people. In fact, I was the only person who really came out directly out of a theatre background. All of us were interested in how do you create a form of theatre that plays to the maximum what theatre is, that it is live and in the moment, and that there is a sense of tension and excitement about what might happen next, and the sense that you are there matters to what is happening, rather than you just being seat G24 in a large auditorium.
Mm-hmm. You have promised to take us further into the way you work with different tools. In 2017, you had a very large-scale installation performance in Aarhus, which some of the viewers might have participated in. It was called We Made Ourselves Over. It was a 90-minute journey into the future of Aarhus, using a GPS system and an app for the audience to navigate in this world that you had created. Could you tell us more about this installation?
Yeah, so what I'd like to do is just show a few slides of that work and just talk a little bit through about the structure of it. And I'll share my screen, and let's hope that that is going to work okay. And then, right.
Yeah.
Hopefully you can see that slide full screen now.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Mm-hmm.
So, can you see? Just get rid of this chat interface down here. Hopefully, right. Lovely. So is that showing okay?
Yes.
Yep.
Great. So this is me with Juro Farr in the middle and Nick Tandavanic on the left. And you know, it's important to say that all the work that we make is a collaboration between the 3 of us. And this project 2097, We Made Ourselves Over, was commissioned by Aarhus Capital of Culture and Hull City of Culture in the UK. So Hull was the UK's City of Culture that year, and Aarhus was one of the European capitals of culture. They jointly commissioned the work, and you know, 2017 was in the aftermath of Trump's election, of the Brexit vote, a moment where political fractures had really come visible at a global level, and our response really was to try and think about looking much further ahead into the future. And so the work is set in 2097, and is we were excited to try and use the breadth of scope of 2 cities to try and do that. And so we did that in a number of different ways. The first starting point for the work is that we were given access to every single phone box in Hull. This is a map of Hull with all the phone boxes marked on it. And the City of Culture said, we have an arrangement with the telecoms company, and that you can have every single phone box. What would you like to create? And that really was the sort of germ of the work. And the very first thing we thought of is, wouldn't it be brilliant if every single phone box rings at exactly the same moment on exactly the same day? And if you pick it up, you are dropped into a story. It seemed like a sort of citywide theatrical moment. We then set about making a series of short documentaries where we interviewed futurologists about 2097, looking 80 years into the future. So we spoke to specialists in the blockchain, in AI, and this lady is in fact a tarot card reader, and we made short films around those. And then we worked with particularly children and with the older generation to hold a series of workshops to gather ideas about how the world might be different in 80 years into the future. And lots of fascinating reflections and ideas came out of those workshops that we then crafted into a script for a series of 5 short science fiction films. And we filmed on the streets of Hull and Aarhus to make these films with the participation of local people in both cities. Those films were then screened online, and in Hull was screened around the city. We went to 40 different locations right on the outskirts of the city, to every single area of the city to show the films. And the films themselves were designed to be watched while, you know, our test for ourselves was it has to be a film that you could be walking past with your shopping in your hands, and that you could stop and watch that film without having to put your shopping down, and that would be an entry point into the work. So we're thinking all of the time about what are the ways in which people might stumble across the work and be drawn into it.
Mm-hmm.
Matt, I'm just going to say that the slides are not changing, but I don't know if there's just one slide. I don't know if you had more slides to show.
Yes, thank you, Sargon. Yes.
You're welcome. I could also tell that many of the viewers couldn't see it. So
why is that? Okay. So can you now see out of the slideshow?
Yeah, now we can see it moving. Yeah.
Sharing is more.
So this was the map of all the phone boxes.
Yeah. So there's some reason why it's pausing my share. Okay, I know what. Maybe what I'll do is. Is that still? Has that slide changed?
No.
No.
Right. I think what I'll do is just leave it in this window. Then I'm sorry it's small, and you're now seeing the slideshow view. But I think at least then you will see those slides as they change.
Yeah, that works fine.
So yes, so this is the lady, the tarot card reader, and this is us in schools and working with the older generation to develop those scripts. And this is us filming on the Humber Bridge in Hull. And this is some of the people that we worked with, both from Hull and from Aarhus in the filming. And this is a shot of the public screening. So we had a mobile screening set up where we would go and show the films to the 40 different areas. And in Hull, actually, we did a partnership with the Premiership football team to show the films during half time at a game that Hull City were playing that season. And then in October that year, at exactly 2 p.m, every phone box in the city rang at the same time. And the person who was ringing was Hesse, who is one of the characters from the future in 2097. And the story that we developed that is played out in all of these different versions, in all these different places, is set in a futuristic composite city called Hull, where in 2097 the city is ruled by 3 teenage girls. The system is that to avoid corruption, 3 girls are given the control of the city, and they decide to erase the city completely and rebuild it using a sort of advanced nanotechnology to rebuild the city as a more equal and equitable place. And so you follow the story as they go about trying to do that and meet the resistance of some people in the community. If you went and picked up one of the phone boxes, there was an experience where some people were picked up by electric car and taken on a ride through the streets of the city by a character from 2097. And so there's an interaction in the back of the car where each audience member is invited to think about the future for themselves and how they might want the future to be different for someone that they love, and to talk about what they might do to create change for that person. And the parallel experience that we created in Aarhus was at the Cykelbahn, the old cycle stadium, and visitors were collected from the center of the city by electric car and chauffeur driven out to the stadium. And the experience began through an audio experience in the back of the car. And then when you arrived at the cycle stadium, you were given a location-based device with a pair of headphones, and you then explored the site. And in the story, this was the place where the three girls had made their fateful decision to destroy the city. And so as you move around from place to place, you gradually understood why they had made their decision and what lay behind it. In this work, in parallel to the version in Hull, where you end up in the back of a car having a one-to-one conversation with someone, in Aarhus, you ended up in small little rooms hidden underneath the stadium, again one-to-one with an actor, and that actor takes you through the same series of discussions about how you might create change for someone in your life. So although the work starts with this very science fictional thread, it actually then comes all the way down to you, someone you love, and what you might do for them to create change in the future. And just alongside all of that was a smartphone app that was also launched and downloadable anywhere in the world, and that tells the same sort of story with the original cast, with the same special effects. We worked with a Hollywood special effects artist to create the future city out of elements of both Hull and Aarhus. And the smartphone app was a place where you could go through a very similar experience of an interaction around thinking about the future. So, sorry, I know that's a fairly long ramble, but it's an unusual work for us in that the scope of the work was citywide, really was. And so there was an opportunity to do something on a canvas that we wouldn't necessarily otherwise have had the chance to do.
Yeah, obviously this was a very large-scaled, ambitious, site-specific piece which interacted with people on many different levels. Do you have to be an expert to really engage with digital tools in the arts? Because I think this is very impressive work, but I think maybe also some theater artists are like, how will I ever be good enough to manage these tools? Yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
I think skill, I'm always a bit skeptical about the value that is placed on skill. You know, I'm really into music, and almost all of the music that I really love is by people who are not considered the most skillful musicians. And the people who are considered the most skillful guitarists who ever lived and stuff, generally I'm completely bored by those people. So it's not to say that there isn't, of course, in large amounts of skill involved, and lots of things to learn. But, you know, one of the things about theatre that's so great, and I think one of the reasons some of us get drawn to it so well, is because it's so immediate, both to experience and to create, and that you can create theatre very quickly. Well, you know, you have there, if you look at that work, you know, you can take any small element of it. Like, for example, a phone rings in a phone box and you pick it up and someone on the end is calling from the future. I mean, any one of us who has a phone could start to make a piece of work like that. So it's not to say that you have to have all of these tools. You know, our very first works use digital technology in very simple and direct ways. I'm not a programmer or a coder. My technical skills are pretty basic, but as you start to explore and play with those tools, I think you can find ways in which they might be used.
Mm-hmm.
Wow,
So you don't have
to
really
interesting.
A very skillful expert, but perhaps a genuine interest in using these tools is perhaps good to have. But Sargon, you were actually you were supposed to premiere with a play just as the Corona lockdown happened, and you were not able to show your play. Which thoughts have you been having about your own practice as an artist in relation to also maybe using different ways of expressing yourself since then?
Well, first of all, I think it was really inspiring just listening to Matt and watching the Blast Theory, watching the work, especially seeing how you guys use this digital platform also to do community work, like how you involve people in a whole nother scale. And it seems like that's the strong part of what you can do in digital theater. You can have this like massive scale portrayal, as I saw in one of the pictures with the electrical cars, and then you can just like bring people into in a room like that to like the whole inner self by a text, and I think that's so inspiring. Yeah, which is maybe a bit different from the forms that you work with. If I'm working with theater on stage, because I have an audience, I have like a physical space that I have to like engage with. But to get back to your answer, Nina, yeah, we were supposed to do Deserteur, which was programmed to premiere, and it didn't because of the coronavirus. And I think just like it has just given me a lot of time to reflect upon my own work as a director, not only by the cancellation, but because of the circumstances, obviously, that the world is in, that we all are in. It makes us think about theater in a whole new way, and also makes us think differently about public space, about other people, in public space. And I think it's very interesting, and also about of course the theater spaces. But as an individual, I am like influenced by it, because it makes you have these different boundaries to make theater in a lot of ways. And for example, that we can't be physical close to each other, or the audience can't be close to the performance. In that way, it makes a lot of boundaries that makes you think in theater in different way. But I think it's very important to distinguish what is digital theater and what is post-pandemic digital theater, because what you do, Matt, seems like it's your way of telling your stories. It's actually a choice of wanting to explore what these digital platforms, how they can tell a story differently. Whereas for me, taking on plays from now on the boundaries that are now because of the coronavirus is another path to go. And I will definitely consider making theater in another way, but that doesn't necessarily have to do with a digital platform. more on a performative way.
Yeah. So just sort of looping back on this question of skill and also of why you might use digital platforms, I think the other thing that I would say is it is partly a political question from my point of view, because it goes to the heart of who gets to speak and who we are listening to. And so at the heart of all of the projects that we make is a fascination with what we are going to hear from people who are participating in the work. And, you know, Nina, you asked about sort of, does it need new skills? I suppose the one thing I would say, the one skill that I do think is really fundamental is an incredibly strong focus on audience experience, and that the work really starts there. It doesn't actually start with a story or a character. Certainly for us, the first half of any development process, we do not have a story. What we're looking for is a performative moment where something special is going to happen. You know, we once were commissioned to make a piece of work for Sundance Film Festival, and they wanted us to make a piece of locative cinema, and we didn't really understand what locative cinema would be. But our development process, we played a whole range of games in the studio and around the studio. And at one point, one of us stood outside the local bank and someone called them and said, okay, you're going to rob this bank in 10 minutes time. And I want you to tell me which window you're going to use to get in to the bank. Look at the bank now and tell me which window is the weak point. And from that tiny moment, the person said, I felt so guilty. I felt like I was going to get arrested any moment just for thinking aloud about how I would rob a bank. And an entire piece of work came from that. So it's relatively no tech, but what it is it's about what's going on in the head of the audience member, the participant, as they receive a phone call and says, you are going to rob this bank. That is where the kind of performance happens. And I think that's the biggest shift, I think, when we work with people from traditional theatre backgrounds, that's the biggest shift for them, is this sense that we're thinking about the audience first and the story comes later.
And then you use...
Yeah, really.
Yeah, Sargun, please.
No, I really like that. It's just... it sounds like a lot of the way that I'm curious about when I do my plays, most of the time, like how to place the audience as the narrative. Actually, around 2017, when you were making the sci-fi play you just showed us, I was making a theater piece called Premiere in Aarhus Theater, or it was a site-specific. And just to short it down, it was like a play written by Magnus Juel Berg, where you could follow 6 different actors on their way to the premiere, like from making the theater play to the actual premiere. And each actor had like around 10 or 20 audience behind them, walking, surrounding them, like, so you could get really, really close. And for me, it was just like a whole nother way to work with audience experiences. What we did was really inspired by how drones fly by people. So as an audience member, you felt like a drone or a fly following the audience member. And what I really liked, or the feedback I got, was that you got so curious on what happened to the other characters, because you followed, in a way, an avatar, just like in Sims, and you walked really close to that person, but you only got a fragment of that person's story. And I really thought that was a nice way of working on a dramatic piece, because normally in theater we always discuss what we all obviously have seen on the stage, but it was really interesting to have a piece where you didn't see all of it, you just saw fragments of it, and you had to put the puzzles together with the other audience members. And sometimes that could also be a way of going or diving into an issue, is like what is the thing that we don't agree on, or what is the thing that we haven't seen, is the thing that we didn't collectively was on the same page on, in a way. And that goes like against the whole traditional of watching a play and all, like, yeah, just been in the same room and been together.
Yeah.
This also corresponds, maybe you have already seen it, Sargun, a question from Maria here in the chat. Your thoughts on audience experience. Matt says that is actually the core of his work, is to think, how does the audience experience this, and how can we activate them? Is this something that is familiar to you, and how do you say you approach this issue?
Sorry again, Nina, can you say the question from the chat again? I didn't get it, so.
This is Maria. She would like to hear more of your thoughts on audience experience. You already talked a little bit about it. Is it important, she asks? How do you work with this?
Yeah, I think it's very, very important. And I personally really like to work with the audience as a narrative, as I said before, especially in the studio stage, as I mentioned before. What we did in those 2 years, I did that in Aarhus Theater with David Geert, scenographer, was to tear down the audience built, what do you call it, publikumsopbygning, the settings of the audience, like the seats. So in each play, we had to start off by defining who is the audience and how do they enter the room. And just that small approach was a way to make us think about the play in a whole different way. And also inviting the audience much more earlier. And I did a lot of interactive plays where people, the audience were moved, where they were pushed, where they didn't have a seat, and we just played around with it a lot, because it just makes the people much more active and make the audience be much more engaged in what they're watching. Because I really think that a theater experience starts with the person thinking, I'm going to the theater tonight, and then purchasing the ticket, and then entering the hall. And it's not just like when the curtains open, as we know it in the theater lingo. It's much more about the inner experience of entering it. And you will always put yourself as the main character in that way. That's why we also have some pieces where some see one guy as the lead role, another see another, because we just watch it so differently. So I think definitely that audience can be a parameter that you can use in a much more much more creative way. Recently, when I did the Sorrows of Young Werther by Goethe, I actually didn't use audience as much as I usually did. So sometimes it's also a way of thinking about, well, if I want to fixate the audience, it can also be the right thing to do. I just think I have to ask these questions to myself every time I approach a work.
Mm-hmm. We have another question coming in from Ulla. This is a question for both of you. What are your thoughts on engaging in the post-pandemic digital theater, as you put it, Sargun? Would you like to be in this box, or?
Would you like to start, Matt, or should I start?
Oh, you go for it, Sargun.
Okay. Well, I think it's very exciting because we're on the verge of it. Like, we can almost not call it post-pandemic, even though I just did, because it's still a pandemic going on now. But my thoughts is that I've seen a lot of really, really, really creative pieces. For example, the latest piece I saw was the graduate student of Aarhus Theater, which made a really creative Zoom play. I think it was written by Nana Cecilie Bang, and Tu Bering was directing it. And you saw this way of challenging the Zoom form in a whole new way. They were like engaging with us, They were engaging with each other through virtual chat rooms. They were calling people. So they had like a lot of creative way of using it, actually in a very touching way that I actually thought that this play, I couldn't imagine it in another way than through this lens. And there's a lot of other things to mention, also site-specific plays, people singing in front of people's homes, and so on and so on. I think it's a new wave of really creative pieces that will come. I really think that if I'm wanting to go and approach these kind of this genre in a way, I will have to really be very clear to myself about how do I use this form. Like, it's not enough for me to just do what I wanted to do normally on stage and then just put a camera on it like I do here. I would really just play around, like, what are the opportunities in this screen and with this connection I have with the other viewer. So I really would think I will have to challenge myself in that way. But I definitely think it's a genre that is here to stay.
Yeah, I would say that it's clearly a social shift in terms of the kinds of work that we might make, because most preconceptions about society are up for renegotiation. There's a kind of loosening of existing structures in which we are making work, and I feel like new ideas about the world are possible and can communicate in different ways. You know, I was listening to a podcast this morning from the New Yorker where you know, a famous tech entrepreneur, businessman from the States called Mark Cuban is advocating giving large amounts of money to people to help them through the crisis. And, you know, things where, you know, different ideas, different ways of thinking are everywhere. And then a narrower sense around theatre. I mean, my personal view is that theatre is already strangled slightly by its model, which is that theatre is a building, and that therefore you build these buildings and you staff them at enormous cost, and then you must fill them with theatre because they've been built and they have a staff. And so you have a kind of model which is predicated on certain kinds of stages being used for theatre, and theatre is a very broad discipline that can happen in a range of different places. Clearly, if sort of post-pandemic means anything, it's that there is a real challenge to people sitting in rows in auditoria, and that there might be new opportunities, new possibilities now. So for me, that feels very exciting, and it feels like there is an opportunity to reformulate where the theatrical moment takes place, and you know, that can happen in loads of ways. You know, we already know it, of course, from things like National Theatre Live and so on. You know, these are existing quite traditional models of embracing the digital, and there's a full spectrum of ways in which you can do it.
And your work is in many ways an example of that. We have a viewer who would like to know if you are inspired, Matt, by live action role-playing games. And where do you draw the line between theater and interactive role-playing?
Yes, kind of inspired and kind of anti-inspired by live action role-playing games. I've only played one once, and I didn't get on with it, but of course, like there is a huge community of people who are LARPing, and we've been lucky enough to have collaborations with people from the LARP community going back sort of 15 years or so, and there is loads to learn from that. and I mentioned already games design, because games design is a different way of thinking about the interactive experience. You know, in a game, you must know what you're doing at every second. Everyone who is playing has to know what they're doing and why they're doing it, and that's very different from most forms of storytelling, where you don't have to have that in quite the same way. So yeah, I think, you know, what's fascinating to me about LARP as a discipline is how varied it is and how intellectually curious it is. You know, that there's loads of people doing fascinating experiments within it, and I'm always really curious to hear about it. You know, that for me, the thing that it kind of grinds for me is the sort of acting out a role. And from, you know, in our work, we try and have a situation where, however much of a role you're acting out, it is largely sort of, it's situated within yourself, and that there is not a need to take on a kind of dramatic role. It's really something where there's a kind of, we talk about it as a sort of on-ramp between I am here as myself and I bought a ticket for a show and I hope I'm going to be entertained, through to perhaps you're now acting as if you're an undercover cop in a pub talking to someone to try and get information out of them. But that transition from yourself to being an undercover cop is a kind of fluid, gentle incline rather than a step change into the kinds of role that you're playing, and that you can slide yourself back and forwards in that sort of role of fictional engagement as you go. Sorry, I hope that makes a scrap of sense. Perhaps I haven't explained it as well as I might, but I think it's you know, the issue is like, how do you create a place of security for the people who are participating in interactive project, such that they then can engage and on their own terms. And, you know, everyone has their own kinds of response, and some people are very happy to be florid and theatrical and put themselves forwards. Many people really don't want to, but they may still want to have an interactive, performative experience.
But when you talk about these transformative moments, is it necessary that the audience take upon a role, or they engage in a kind of role-playing way, or how do you find these transformative moments?
I think it's different for different pieces of work. You know, I mentioned the bank robbery piece earlier on. It's called A Machine to See With. In that work, the very final thing that you do is you take some of your own money and you give it to a stranger. That's the sort of final task. And that's quite a transgressive act in public space, to literally find a passerby and give them some money. And the work, of course, you know, playing with ideas of money and theft and criminality and currency all the way through it. And so, you know, the people who participate in that work talk about that moment of choosing someone and navigating this act of giving cash to a stranger in the street as being a transformative moment, because it creates a connection that you would never otherwise do. And if I asked you to do it straight away without any sort of scaffolding, you perhaps would not be able to do that. But if you've done an hour-long interactive experience on the street, where you've taken a whole set of different steps, you arrive at this moment where that feels like, yes, okay, I will do this. And you know, we often use the phrase "act otherwise" as to think about what the goal of the work is. It's to give you permission to behave in a way that you might not otherwise in your normal life. And that, to me, when that's happening, that's a beautiful, exciting thing. You have a chance, and maybe it's the tiniest thing. Maybe it is uttering something alone in a room with a stranger about someone you love and how you might want things to be different for them, that you have not uttered before out loud to anyone else. It can be a tiny fragment, or it can be something grander or something larger. But that's the theatrical experience for me. You go into an experience and you come out slightly changed by it. And I think when you create work that is participatory and interactive, you put fresh demands on your audience, but there are fresh possibilities for what you might be able to give them in return.
And that can lead to perhaps a transformative moment. We don't have so much time left, but I think we should talk about the physical experience of theater, because that is, after all, many people would say the core of the theater, the body, the physical meeting and the physical experience, which is undergoing a change right now. And Sargun, it's something you have been talking about also in different interviews, what happens to the space when we are not in the same room. And there's also a question here from a viewer, how to go about creating and engaging the audience when interaction in the real world is not possible. We've been talking about this for the last 45 minutes, but shouldn't we also be critical of this loss of the physical meeting? What do you think, Sargun?
Well, really good question. I think as Matt mentioned before, what we experience about what we had before the coronavirus was these theater buildings where we came to experience theater. And there has been a lot of movements to just like do something else than that. We have seen examples on site-specific audio walks, a lot of other things like that. I think what the coronavirus did was not just like making this huge social, how do you say, boundaries of how to interact with other people, but they also hacked, the coronavirus hacked the theater buildings also. We had to think differently, and we have to use the digital format in a whole new way, maybe also in ways that we kind of didn't really saw as a way of making theater. But in the absence of meeting, in the absence of being in a room together, we also see why we do need these buildings and why they also was a space for people meeting and watching the performers, being in this liveness, as you mentioned before, Matt, that sense of that what happens now happens in front of me now. And I also think, like, if you look at the different digital offerings, as easy it is to engage, it's also easy to unengage. I mean, just as we're talking now, maybe some people are going out getting their coffees, maybe they're just having on their second screen on their phones. What we did have before with these theater buildings was also the sacred space of we're going into this experience together. So maybe we should see it as a pendulum, you know. Now we just have been swinging one way and the pendulum is on its way to another way. And life is not either or, it's maybe both. And right now we're swinging in another way, and we'll get back to another swing in a moment. Because I really think that we as people need this kinesthetic response. We need to be in a body with each other, because we are also made of biology and this interaction, this looking into each other's eyes. Yeah, that's my thoughts on that.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to respond to that, Matt?
Yeah, I really agree with what you're saying, Sargun. I mean, I think it's important to say that theatre is always a hybrid experience in terms of live and technology. You know, since electric lights were being used on stage, there's a hybridity going on. You know, the average West End theatre production has, you know, more computers than were used to send man to the moon. You know, they're high tech operations in the background, you know, so we shouldn't set up artificial polarities between sort of human contact and technology. To me, that's quite an old-fashioned idea that these things are oppositional, as opposed to interthreaded in weird and confusing and conflicting ways, but ways that we are all trying to sort of work out what it means. The idea that we all carry a computer with us, you know, close to our heart 24 hours a day is a kind of confusing and bizarre thing. But that's something to kind of explore and make sense of. And on the issue of sort of physical interaction, you know, my view is that we will find ways to accommodate this quicker than is perhaps clear at the moment. At the moment, it may seem confusing and unclear, but you know, there are many different ways to create the theatrical experience. And you know, in the UK, the social distancing distance is 2 meters. 2 meters is quite close. It may be further away than we are used to being, but it's, you know, there are many different ways to have a human experience with someone who is 2 meters away from you. So for me, there are loads of possibilities for how we can create the theatrical experience in physical space around social distancing. And in any case, you know, it's important to remember that in a bad year, 600,000 people die of flu around the world each year. We do not stop interacting because 600,000 people die of flu. Okay, yeah, we are in the midst of a very serious pandemic, but you know, humans have adjusted and dealt with epidemics and pandemics all through history, and we will do so again.
And perhaps it's also important to underscore that this is perhaps not a social distancing, but a physical distancing, and we don't have to socially distance each other, us from each other. And for that, I think art plays a very important role in this period of time. We have 2 minutes left. Is there any last piece of advice, Matt, you would like to offer for theater makers and performance artists who would like to dive into working with digital tools?
Yeah. One thing that we haven't mentioned that I would talk about is context. If you're a theatre maker, you get very used to the idea that you are working on a proscenium stage or a traverse stage or a thrust stage. The size of the stage is a key determinant of what work you create very early on. If you're working in a digital platform, it's exactly the same, except you're not dealing with quite the same set of properties. But you know, the mobile web is a very different place from email and is a very different place from Twitter, and different kinds of utterances take place there, and different kinds of character presentations might happen there. And you know, my sort of tip would be that you need to look incredibly carefully at what is the context here, what are the affordances of this space. How do people talk? In what kinds of conversations are possible? What kinds of visibility of humanity happens here? And to then really use that as the kind of the parameter within which you begin to create. And it's, you know, it's a very fascinating thing. If you say, okay, yeah, what is Beckett if it's done through tweets? You know, it's like, it's probably quite terrible, but as a thought experiment in terms of what that means when that kind of experience goes through that kind of channel, you immediately realize, oh well, it's going to be something really pretty different. But Waiting for Godot via Twitter could probably, you know, you could probably make that work in some way. So it's, you know, there is something to learn about each of the kinds of digital platforms. They are not interchangeable, and they all have their own characteristics that are rich with possibilities.
I'm sure we will see a lot of different experiments in the future. Thanks a lot, Matt and Sargun, for joining us today. And yeah, I think Sarah will just say some words.
Yeah, but you already said some of it. Thank you very much. It was a interesting talk, and I think we could have gone on for another hour or two, or maybe the whole day. I know that people kept asking things, but I'm sure people will continue the discussion everywhere. This was it for today. People with busy lives have to go on. Tomorrow afternoon we have another event, which is focusing on the work of the dramaturge. And I'll put a link in the chat so you can go and visit that if you want to talk more with your colleagues. But thank you a lot again, Matt and Sargon and Nina. Hope to see you soon again.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Nina.
Thank you.
Everyone for coming.
Bye.
Take care.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.